The evening air in Washington, D.C. carried the scent of rain, the pavement still damp from an earlier shower. The glow of streetlights cast long shadows as Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, walked briskly down the sidewalk. She rarely had time for walks these days. Her schedule was dominated by intelligence briefings, security meetings, and classified reports filled with problems no one seemed willing to solve. But tonight, she had needed to clear her head. Her mind was on the worsening border crisis. It wasn't just numbers in a report, it was chaos. Cities overwhelmed. Gangs and drug traffickers pouring into the country. And Washington's politicians? Most of them were either too corrupt, too cowardly, or too oblivious to do anything about it. Up ahead, voices rose above the usual nighttime hum of the city. Tulsi's trained instincts kicked in. She quickened her pace, turning a corner onto a quieter street, and saw them. A group of children, 4 or 5 of them, no older than 12, stood frozen near a building entrance. Cornering them were 4 men, speaking in a mix of Spanish and broken English. Their clothes were ragged, their movements aggressive. She knew exactly what was happening. Before she could act, someone else stepped forward. "Get away from them," the voice commanded. It was firm, unyielding. A young man in military fatigues stood between the children and their attackers. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his posture rigid with discipline. "A soldier." One of the men sneered. "Mind your business, gringo." The soldier didn't move. "I said," he repeated, his voice lower now, full of warning, "get lost." The gang hesitated. They could tell this wasn't an ordinary civilian. There was no fear in his stance, no hesitation. The moment stretched long, tense, until finally the men cursed under their breath and disappeared into the shadows. The soldier exhaled, then turned to the children. "Are you hurt?" The oldest boy shook his head. "No, sir." "Go home. Don't stop. Don't talk to anyone." The kids nodded and ran. That was when the soldier noticed Tulsi approaching. "That was well handled," she said, watching him carefully. The soldier straightened slightly, recognizing her now. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. "At ease," she replied. He nodded, then extended his hand. "Lieutenant Daniel Carter, U.S. Army." She shook it. "Tulsi Gabbard." Carter's expression shifted slightly. "I know who you are." Tulsi raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" "Yes, ma'am. Director of National Intelligence. Former Congresswoman. One of the only people in Washington who still gives a damn about the military." She let out a short breath, half a chuckle. "That's a rare compliment these days." Carter shrugged. "That's because too many of the people running this country have never worn the uniform." Tulsi nodded. "That's a big part of the problem." She studied him for a moment. He wasn't like the officers she met in D.C., the ones who spent more time in meetings than in the field. He was a real soldier. The kind Washington had spent years neglecting. Carter glanced back toward the alley where the gang had disappeared. "This city's a mess," he muttered. "Hell, the whole country is." Tulsi sighed. "It didn't have to be." Carter turned back to her. "Then why is it?" She knew the answer. It was corruption. Weakness. The kind of leadership that cared more about political optics than national security. "Because the wrong people have been in charge for too long," she said simply. Carter scoffed. "You don't have to tell me. I served under the last administration." Tulsi's eyes sharpened. "And?" Carter clenched his jaw. "And it was a disaster." He looked away for a moment, like he was debating whether to continue. Then, with a bitter shake of his head, he did. "They turned the military into a damn social experiment," he said. "Lowered physical standards, pushed useless training, put woke politics ahead of combat readiness. We spent more time in diversity seminars than on the range." Tulsi exhaled. "I know. And the worst part," Carter continued, "they made it clear, if you questioned any of it, if you pushed back, you were the problem." His voice carried the frustration of countless soldiers who had watched their profession be hollowed out by bureaucrats who had never seen combat. Tulsi folded her arms. "I heard from plenty of people like you when I was in Congress. Officers who wanted to train warriors, not activists." Carter scoffed. Yeah, well, they didn't last long, did they? No, she admitted. They didn't. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Carter gestured around them. And now look at this city. Criminals running wild. Illegals flooding in. And what does Washington do? Nothing. Tulsi's jaw tightened. It's worse than nothing. They protect the lawbreakers. Meanwhile, American citizens, American kids, are left to fend for themselves. Carter shook his head in disgust. And they call us extremists for wanting to secure the border. She let out a dry chuckle. Yeah. Because apparently, expecting a country to have a border is bigoted now. Carter's expression darkened. I was stationed down there for a while. I saw what's really happening. The media won't tell the truth. These aren't just poor families looking for a better life. We're talking about cartel members, gangbangers, traffickers. These people aren't refugees. They're invaders. Tulsi nodded. I know. I've seen the classified reports. Carter looked at her. Then why does it feel like nothing ever changes? She sighed. Because too many good people gave up. And the ones who stayed, they either got ignored or destroyed. Carter clenched his fists. Then we fight anyway. Tulsi studied him again. He meant it. And she did too. We have to, she said firmly. Because if we don't, this country won't survive. Carter nodded. Then we fix the military. We fix the border. We take our country back. Tulsi extended her hand again. I appreciate your service, Lieutenant. He shook it without hesitation. And I appreciate yours, ma'am. As she turned to leave, Carter called after her, his voice strong and unwavering. It's an honor to be an American. Tulsi smiled as she walked into the night. The fight was far from over. But as long as men like Carter still stood their ground, there was hope. The street lamp above them buzzed faintly, casting a dull yellow glow over the damp pavement. Tulsi Gabbard and Lieutenant Daniel Carter stood facing each other, neither in a hurry to leave. The city around them moved on, cars rushed past, pedestrians walked with purpose, oblivious to the conversation unfolding. But for them, this moment wasn't just small talk. It was about something deeper, something bigger. It was about the country they loved. It wasn't always like this, Carter said, shaking his head. I grew up believing in this country. My father fought in Desert Storm. My grandfather in Vietnam. My whole family served. And back then, he gestured around at the city. America meant something. Tulsi nodded. And now? Carter let out a bitter chuckle. Now, if you say you're proud to be American, they call you a fascist. Tulsi sighed. I wish I could say you were wrong. Carter glanced toward the alley where the illegal migrants had run off. That's just it. It's not just about the military, ma'am. It's everything. The border, the economy, the government. It's all being torn apart, and the people running the show don't care. Tulsi folded her arms. No, they don't. Carter continued, his voice steady but laced with frustration. We're being told we have to accept this. That it's just the way things are now. But why? Tulsi met his gaze. Because they want us to be weak. Carter exhaled sharply. It's working. A silence settled between them, heavy with truth. I was stationed at the border last year, Carter said. What I saw. It was worse than anything they show on TV. The cartels run that place. We had armed men crossing into our country, laughing at us because they knew we weren't allowed to do a damn thing. Tulsi clenched her jaw. She had seen the classified reports. She had read the testimonies from Border Patrol agents who had their hands tied by weak policies. But hearing it directly from a soldier who had been there made it hit even harder. We had kids, Carter continued, little girls, no older than 10, being sold. And you know who brought them over? Grown men, not their fathers. And we weren't even allowed to ask questions. His fists clenched at his sides. Because some suit in Washington thought that would be racist. Tulsi's voice was cold. It's not racism. It's common sense. Carter scoffed. Tell that to the media. He took a step back, shaking his head. And the worst part? When we did try to do our jobs, we got labeled as monsters. Every time we arrested a criminal, some activist group would cry about human rights violations. Tulsi's expression darkened. But they don't care about the victims, do they? Carter laughed bitterly. Not unless the victims fit their narrative. Another silence. The reality of what they were discussing wasn't just political. It wasn't theoretical. It was real. And it was destroying the country. Carter exhaled slowly, composing himself. You were in the military, ma'am. You get it. When did it get this bad? Tulsi looked toward the Capitol building in the distance. The rot started years ago, she said. Maybe decades. But in the last few years, it's accelerated. They realized they could push the limits, and no one would stop them. Carter nodded. And now they think they're untouchable. Tulsi's eyes sharpened. They are untouchable, until people like us decide they aren't. Carter studied her. He could tell she wasn't just talking. She meant it. We need to rebuild this country, Tulsi continued. And it starts with getting rid of the weak leaders who let it fall apart. Carter crossed his arms. How? Tulsi smiled faintly. By not backing down. Carter chuckled. You make it sound easy. It won't be, she admitted. But if we don't fight back now, we might not get another chance. Carter exhaled. Well, ma'am, you've got one soldier who's ready. Tulsi extended her hand again. Then let's take our country back. Carter grasped it firmly. Yes, ma'am. The wind picked up, carrying the sounds of the city around them. They weren't done talking. There was still so much to say. But for the first time in a long time, Carter felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The city around them moved on, pedestrians walked past, lost in their own worlds, and the hum of traffic filled the streets. But here, standing beneath the dim glow of the streetlights, Tulsi and Carter were locked in something deeper than casual conversation. This wasn't small talk. This was two Americans who had dedicated their lives to serving their country, now standing in its capital, discussing its collapse. Carter's gaze was distant, his mind replaying memories from his years in uniform. I'll be honest with you, ma'am, he said, voice quieter than before. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd be standing on an American street, chasing off criminals who aren't even supposed to be here, while Washington does nothing, I wouldn't have believed them. Tulsi sighed, nodding. Neither would I. Carter let out a bitter chuckle. You know what hurts the most? It's not just the politicians screwing us over. It's the brass. The people at the top who know better but still go along with it. Tulsi met his eyes. Because they want promotions. They want book deals and TV contracts when they retire. They don't care about the rank and file. Carter's jaw clenched. Damn right they don't. I've lost count of how many real leaders, good men, the kind who actually gave a damn about their troops, were forced out because they wouldn't play along with the garbage. He scoffed. Meanwhile, the ones who did, the ones who sat through the sensitivity training with a smile and nodded along when they were told that warfighting wasn't the real priority anymore. He spat on the ground. They got promoted. I saw it too, Tulsi admitted. And the worst part? It's deliberate. Carter frowned. You think so? I know so, she said firmly. A strong military is a threat to corrupt leaders. If you weaken the armed forces, you weaken the country. And a weak country is easier to control. Carter exhaled sharply. Well, mission accomplished then. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of it all pressing down on them. Then Carter spoke again, his voice filled with frustration. You ever wonder why so many veterans are angry? Tulsi nodded. Because they feel betrayed. Because they were betrayed, Carter corrected her. We fought for this country, and in return, they treated us like dirt. They let us rot in VA hospitals while they sent billions to foreign countries that hate us. They turned our victories into defeats by walking away from wars we won, just because it was politically convenient. Tulsi's face darkened. Afghanistan. Carter let out a slow breath. Yeah. They both knew. The moment the last U.S. plane left Kabul, leaving Americans and allies behind to face the Taliban, something inside the soul of America broke. I watched friends die over there, Carter said, voice heavy. I lost brothers. And for what? He shook his head. So some corrupt bureaucrats could pull the plug and hand the whole damn country back to the same people we spent 20 years fighting? Tulsi swallowed hard. She had seen the images too. The desperate Afghans clinging to U.S. planes. The chaos. The suicide bombing at the airport that killed 13 American service members. And the administration? The same people who had botched the withdrawal? They called it a success. Carter's hands curled into fists. You know what the worst part was? Tulsi looked at him. What? They didn't even care. His voice was bitter now. 13 of our own came home in coffins, and the people in charge, the ones who caused it? They gave speeches about how we should be proud of the withdrawal. They patted themselves on the back. His fists tightened. Not a single damn one of them resigned. Tulsi took a slow breath. She had felt the same rage when she had watched the press conferences, listened to the excuses, the deflections. They abandoned Americans behind enemy lines, Carter continued. And now, they expect guys like me to sign up and serve under them? He laughed bitterly. No wonder recruitment's in the toilet. Tulsi nodded. Young men don't want to fight for a country that doesn't fight for them. Carter scoffed. Damn right. They let our cities rot. They let criminals walk free while they go after people who actually love this country. They tell us we're the problem, that our values, our patriotism, our faith, it's all backward. He shook his head. Why would any young man want to sign up and fight for this? Tulsi sighed. They wouldn't. Carter exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You know, I joined the military because I believed in something bigger than myself. I believed in America. He let out a humorless chuckle. Now, they tell me that's the problem. Tulsi smirked. Let me guess, they called you an extremist? Oh yeah, Carter said sarcastically. Apparently, wanting the best for my country makes me dangerous. Tulsi folded her arms. You're not alone. They've tried to purge anyone who still has a spine, whether it's in the military, law enforcement, or even just the average American who speaks up. Carter nodded. And it's working. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Carter spoke again. You ever notice how they never call the people burning down cities extremists? Tulsi let out a dry chuckle. Yeah. Funny how that works. Carter's face hardened. But the second someone waves an American flag and says they love their country, suddenly they're a threat to democracy. Tulsi met his gaze. Because they fear real patriots more than criminals. Carter nodded. Yeah. Another silence. Then Carter spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I don't recognize this country anymore. Tulsi looked at him. Then we take it back, she said. Carter studied her. You really think we can? Her expression was unshakable. I wouldn't be standing here if I didn't. Carter exhaled slowly, looking past her toward the Capitol in the distance. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. But it wasn't going to be easy. And it wasn't going to be peaceful. The wind picked up again, rattling the leaves along the sidewalk as Tulsi and Carter stood beneath the dim streetlights, locked in a conversation that neither wanted to end. There was too much left to say. Too much left to fix. Carter exhaled, staring past her at the distant glow of the Capitol. That place, he muttered. You ever get the feeling that it doesn't belong to us anymore? Tulsi followed his gaze. The dome stood tall against the dark sky, illuminated like a beacon, but to who? The American people. Or the elite who had spent years hollowing out the country from within. It hasn't for a long time, she said finally. They sit in their ivory towers, passing laws that don't affect them. Sending money to foreign countries while our own people can't afford rent. Lecturing us on morality, while they ignore the suffering in their own cities. Carter scoffed. And they expect us to just sit back and take it. They expect us to be too beaten down to resist, Tulsi corrected. That's why they attack people like you. Carter frowned. Like me. Like us, she clarified. People who love this country. People who won't shut up and fall in line. The average American who just wants to live a decent life without being told they're the enemy. Carter's jaw tightened. That's exactly how they treat us. The enemy. Tulsi nodded. Because they know we're the only thing standing between them and complete control. Carter folded his arms. Then we stand. She smirked. Damn right we do. A heavy silence passed between them. It wasn't just words. It was a shared understanding, one forged from experience, from anger, from truth. Finally, Carter spoke again. We need to fix the military. Tulsi nodded. We need to fix everything. Carter let out a slow breath. Where do we even start? Tulsi's expression hardened. We start by speaking the truth. Loudly. Unapologetically. We stop letting them dictate the conversation. No more playing defense. Carter smirked. You sound like a general rallying the troops. She chuckled. I guess I am. Carter nodded, his smirk fading into something more serious. So what's next? Tulsi met his gaze. We take back our institutions. We elect real leaders. We expose the corruption. We push back against every policy designed to weaken this country. Carter chuckled darkly. Sounds like a war. It is a war, Tulsi said bluntly. A war for America's future. Carter exhaled sharply. Then I guess we'd better fight like hell. Tulsi extended her hand one last time. We will. Carter shook it firmly. Yes, ma'am. As she turned to leave, Carter called after her, his voice strong and unwavering. It's an honor to be an American. Tulsi smiled as she disappeared into the night. The battle wasn't over. But tonight, on this quiet street in the heart of a crumbling capital, the spirit of America still burned bright. And as long as that fire remained, there was still hope.